Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning into today's Author Talk series brought to you by the Library Speakers Consortium. The Library Speakers Consortium is a partnership of more than 450 library systems across the US, Canada, and New Zealand with the goal of making Author Talks more accessible to communities of all sizes. I am Brandon Adler, your host and moderator in conversation with all of the amazing authors and presenters that you will hear from throughout our series. Today, I am so honored to be here with New York Times bestselling author and journalist Garrett Graff to chat about his monumental body of historical work, with particular focus on The Only Plane in the Sky, an oral history of 9/11. So welcome, Garrett. Thank you so much for being here today.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be able to talk to all of you across the country today.
And I know that everybody is super excited to get started, but before we do that, let's pause and kind of do some standard housekeeping information that keeps everything running smoothly. We have compiled some questions that were pre-submitted with registration, but as always, you can submit questions throughout the entirety of the event by clicking that questions button that's just below the live stream video. Keep in mind, there are a lot of you tuning in today, so we will get to as many questions as possible. And if you have to leave early for any reason whatsoever, all registrants do receive a link to the recording in about 24 hours. Now, to formally introduce our guest for today. Garrett M. Graff has spent nearly 2 decades covering politics, technology, and national security. The former editor of Politico and contributor to Wired and CNN, he's written for publications from Esquire to Rolling Stone to the New York Times, and today serves as the director of the Cyber Initiative at the Aspen Institute. Graff is the author of multiple books, including the FBI history, The Threat Matrix, Raven Rock, about the government's Cold War doomsday plans, When the Sea Came Alive, an oral history of D-Day, which I'm sure we might touch on a little bit today, and the New York Times bestsellers, The Only Plane in the Sky and Watergate, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in History. Again, thank you so much for being here. We have some amazing questions for you today, Garrett. I hope you're ready. Of course, one of the most questions that we get is about kind of the inspiration behind everything. Cheryl from Los Gatos Library and many, many other people are saying, can you please tell us about your book, The Only Plane in the Sky? What inspired you to tell this story and why as an oral history?
Yeah. So this is a great week, of course, to be talking about The Only Plane in the Sky as we mark tomorrow the 22nd anniversary, the 23rd anniversary, of 9/11. This is a project that really began for me with the 15th anniversary in 2016. I wrote a oral history then for Politico magazine about being aboard Air Force One with President Bush on 9/11. As those of you who are old enough to remember 9/11 probably recall, President Bush started the day in Sarasota, Florida, reading to elementary school children, and then was evacuated from there and spent the day hopscotching across the country, first actually to Barksdale Air Force Base in Shreveport, Louisiana, then on to Offutt Air Force Base in Omaha, Nebraska, before it was deemed safe to bring him back to Washington. So for that 15th anniversary, I went back and interviewed about 30 people around George W. Bush that day. Everyone from the pilot of Air Force One to White House Chief of Staff Andy Card, to Karl Rove, to Press Secretary Ari Fleischer, the Secret Service agents who were with the president that day, the press corps who were on board the Air Force One, the Air Force communications technicians, and other personnel and White House staff who had a window into the president's day. That piece published in 2016 and very quickly became the most read article in Politico's history. It was titled, "We're the Only Plane in the Sky," which was a reference to the leg of the flight when Air Force One was headed back to Washington on the afternoon of Tuesday, September the 11th, from Offutt Air Force Base around 4 or 5 p.m. Eastern time that afternoon. And I got, at first scores, then ultimately hundreds of emails and social media messages from readers of that article. And two of them really stuck out for me. The first was a letter from a young soldier who had done 3 tours overseas at that point. I think it was 2 in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq. And he talked about how he had been in middle school on 9/11 and how he had not really understood the emotional trauma of that day for the country until he had read my article and seen the day through President Bush's eyes. And there was another letter from another soldier, a mother who had 2 children. They were 7 and 9 back then in 2016. And she said that she had printed out my article and set it aside for when her daughters were old enough for her to talk to them about why mommy had left them to go off to war.
Mm.
And those 2 letters really just struck me and made me think about the way that we now had this generation coming of age who were too young to remember 9/11. People who had grown up in a world shaped in ways big and small by the events of September 11th, and yet had never actually understood or lived the emotional trauma of that day. And it was letters like that that then inspired me to turn that article into the full length book that you mentioned, The Only Plane in the Sky, which came out in 2019. And 2019, of course, was its own important milestone for 9/11. It was the 18th anniversary of 9/11, which was a moment where, in a very real way, 9/11 began to slip from memory into history. You had the first US military personnel going through basic training born after 9/11 and deploying to Iraq and Afghanistan to fight in wars that had begun before they were born. You had the first recruits coming into the fire department of New York who had been born after 9/11, after that day that devastated that agency and killed 343 members of the New York Fire Department. And for me, I wanted to try to tell the story of 9/11 in the voices of the people who experienced it. So The Only Plane in the Sky pulls together about 500 voices. I think it's about 480 total voices. All Americans who lived that day, morning to night, coast to coast, all across the country. And to me, the power of oral history for an event like 9/11 is in the way that it puts you back in the footsteps of those who lived that day and experienced it, knowing only what they knew at the time. That, to me, the challenge of 9/11 now, and here we are in 2024, and about a third of the United States is now too young to remember 9/11. And what the story that we tell those people in history books is this neat and simple and tidy version of the 9/11 history. There were 4 planes. The attack begins at 8:46 in the morning. It is over 102 minutes later with the collapse of the second tower at 10:28. You have New York, you have Pennsylvania, you have the Pentagon. You have about 3,000 total casualties. And to me, the challenge, of course, is that for those of us who were alive that day, That's not the 9/11 that any of us actually remember. That if you were alive on 9/11, we didn't know when the attacks began. We didn't know when they were over. We didn't know that there were only 4 of them. It's easy to forget now that as late as about 1 o'clock that afternoon, the US government believed that there were more than a dozen additional hijacked planes still in the sky over the United States. There was also no sense that day that those attacks were confined to just New York, Washington, and Pennsylvania. If you were in Boston or Chicago or Los Angeles, the skyscrapers were evacuated. Disney closed in Florida. The Toronto subway shut down because of fears of a follow-on attack. And of course, over the course of 9/11 itself, none of us knew what came next. None of us knew what came in the afternoon of September 11th, what might come on September 12th, what might come in October, what might come in 2002. And to me, you can't understand the way that the United States responded to 9/11. You can't understand and contextualize the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. You can't contextualize and understand events like the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, the CIA torture program, the TSA, the warning systems, the active shooter drills that we now live with in the United States without understanding that emotional chaos, confusion, and trauma that unfolded over the course of 9/11 for those of us who lived through that day. So to me, the goal with this book was to try to keep that memory alive of what that day, not the way that we teach it in history, but what that day was like to live and experience. And to me, that was the power of doing it as an oral history.
Mm-hmm. The emotion, the raw emotion of everyday people. I know myself reading it, just goosebumps and tears the entire time. So it's my understanding that you have flagged a chapter that you would like to read from your book. I think that'll be especially helpful, like you mentioned when we were talking earlier, for those who haven't read it yet, to get a better understanding of kind of the structure of an oral history.
Sure. This is a chapter called Inside Air Traffic Control. Takes place between 8 a.m. and 9 a.m. on Tuesday, September the 11th, 2001. Peter Zalewski, air traffic controller, Boston Center, Nashua, New Hampshire. When American Airlines Flight 11 came to me, the pilot said, "Boston Center, this is American 11, climbing to flight level 230. I called him many, many times. American 11, how do you hear? American 11, this is Boston Center. Do you hear me?" I'm calling and calling. And I'm like, my God, maybe they're drinking Dunkin' Donuts coffee up there. Honestly, that's what I was thinking. Then there are these transmissions. The first transmission from the aircraft, it's garbled to me. I don't understand it. Then there was a second one, a voice. I remember him saying, "Nobody move, please. We're going back to the airport." I will never forget that feeling up the back of my neck. It was like this adrenaline or something. I felt fear. I'm like, oh my God, this plane's been hijacked. Colin Scogans, Airspace and Procedure Specialist, FAA, Boston Center. I came in at about 8:25 in the morning, and as soon as I walked to the front door, someone came to me and said there was a hijack going on. We'd worked hijacks in the past, and they were usually uneventful. Peter Zalewski. I yell at the supervisor, "John, get over here. This plane's been hijacked." "Absolutely." I go, "It's Middle Eastern voices. Positive." I could tell by the second time. I was used to working Egypt Air, Saudi, Turkish, all of them. It's Middle Eastern voices. Colin Scogans. Mohammed Atta, the pilot of American 11, the lead terrorist, stated something about more planes. that they had more planes. It was definitely plural. That's when things really started to ramp up. Ben Sliney, National Operations Manager, FAA Command Center, Herndon, Virginia. I was the National Operations Manager on 9/11. That is a position located in the Washington area that has the overarching authority over the nation's airspace. That was my charge, the safe and efficient operation of the nation's airspace. Colonel Bob Marr, Commander, Northeast Air Defense, Rome, New York. There was a huddle of people around one of the radar scopes. I saw that huddle and thought, there's got to be something wrong. Major General Larry Arnold, Commander, 1st Air Force, NORAD, Tyndall Air Force Base, Florida. We had a major North American air defense exercise that morning, a command post exercise. There was a team of people that introduced scenarios that you have to react to and respond to. As we were winding up the exercise briefing, my executive officer, Lieutenant Colonel Kelly Duckett, handed me a slip of paper. Bob Marr had called and said there was a hijacking in the Boston Center area. Ben Sliney. My experience with hijackings and our protocol was that we cooperate. Lieutenant Colonel Don Deskins, Mission Crew Commander, Northeast Air Defense, Rome, New York. At this point, our mindset was the 1970s vintage hijack. We didn't have a huge concern this aircraft was going to crash. Major General Larry Arnold. I said, Bob, go ahead and scramble the fighters. Major Joe McCready, F-15 pilot, Otis Air Force Base, Cape Cod, Massachusetts. A scramble order was issued. I ran to our jets. I started up. We realized we didn't have any weapons. They filled up our jets with gas, and even though we were Winchester, which means we had no weapons, we took off. Lieutenant Colonel Tim Duffy, F-15 pilot, Otis Air Force Base, Cape Cod, Massachusetts. When we took off, I left it in full afterburner the whole time. We were supersonic going down to Long Island, and my wingman, Nasty, that's Major Dan Nash, called and said, hey, Duff, you're super. And I said, yeah, I know. Don't worry about it. I just wanted to get there. Colonel Bob Marr. At Mach 1, it would take them about 16 minutes to get there. That's 10 miles a minute. Lieutenant Colonel Kevin Nisipany, Mission Commander, Northeast Air Defense, Rome, New York. Almost simultaneously, we brought in more surveillance technicians to look at the scope. Staff Sergeant Larry Thornton, Northeast Air Defense. The area was so congested, the hijacked flight was incredibly difficult to find. We were looking for little dash marks in a pile of clutter on a two-dimensional scope. Master Sergeant Joe McCain, Northeast Air Defense. We picked up a search track going down the Hudson Valley, straight in from the north toward New York. The plane was fast and headed in an unusual direction with no transponder on. We watched that track until it faded over New York City. Lieutenant General Tom Keck, Commander, Barksdale Air Force Base, Shreveport, Louisiana. We were in the midst of this big annual exercise called Global Guardian. They loaded all the bombers, put the submarines out to sea, put the ICBMs at 100% readiness. It was routine. You did it every year. A captain said, "Sir, we had an aircraft hit the World Trade Center." I started to correct him, saying, when you have an exercise input, you have to start by saying, I have an exercise input. That way, it doesn't get confused with the real world. Then he pointed me to the TV screens in the command center. You could see smoke pouring out of the building. Like everyone else in aviation that day, I thought, how in a clear and a million day could someone have hit the World Trade Center? That chapter, to me, illustrates, I think, one of the most important things that I try to talk about when I talk to a new generation about 9/11 and its impact on the country, which is the 17 most interesting moments of 9/11, which are that time between that first crash and that second crash, 8:46 in the morning to 9:03. Because what you see in those 17 minutes is just how innocent America actually was that morning of Tuesday, September the 11th, where that first crash happens and America mostly shrugs. And you see sort of from New York all the way up to the President of the United States, this moment, these 17 minutes, where people sort of have the same set of strange reactions that General Keck had, which is, how did a plane hit the World Trade Center? It must have been a small plane. Maybe the pilot had a heart attack. Maybe there was a mechanical problem. Maybe it was an air traffic control mistake. And then everyone goes on about their day. There's this quote in the book, to me, one of the most powerful and poignant of the entire book, that talks about it's the perspective of a New York waterways ferry captain, one of the commuter passenger ferries in New York Harbor, who is bringing a load of commuters in from New Jersey. They watch from the boat as that first plane hits the North Tower at 8:46. And then in the next few minutes, he pulls his ferry into Wall Street Terminal at the tip of Lower Manhattan there. And every single commuter gets off the boat and walks into Lower Manhattan. And they get off walking through the wreckage and the paper fluttering down from that first impact zone in the North Tower. They get off walking through paper falling down around them. And there's not a single person on the boat who sees that crash and then says, you know what, this just kind of seems like it's got some weird vibes to it today. I think I'm going to turn around and go back to New Jersey. You see National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice in those same moments in Washington call the president at Emma Booker Elementary School in Sarasota, Florida. And she says to him, this plane has crashed. And they have the same conversation that the rest of America has. Well, that's weird. Must have been a small plane, must have been a terrible accident. Let's wait and learn more. And Condi Rice hangs up the phone and walks on into her normal 9 a.m. staff meeting. And President Bush famously, of course, walks into that classroom to begin reading to elementary school students that book, My Pet Goat. And it's not until that second crash, the crash at 9:03, which is actually caught live, of course, on most of the TV channels by then. And it's only then that America realizes that it's under attack. And what you see for those 17 minutes is just how innocent America actually was. Because, of course, an event like that today, America is now afraid of public space in a way that we never were on 9/11. That you would, you hear a motorcycle backfire or a loud noise at a shopping mall or a school, and we know how to do all of these active shooter drills and to evacuate and do lockdown drills, and all of that is new to our country post 9/11. And so to me, it's so important to try to tell that story, to remind people of what our country was like, both over the course of 9/11 and the unity, of course, that follows, but also to remember what we were like at 8:46 that morning before it all started.
Mm-hmm. So we have several people wondering about your own emotion, the impact that you had in reading and collecting all of these oral histories. Teresa from Butte County Library says, I'm curious about the emotional impact on Garrett when collecting these stories. I've read the 9/11 book, and it's awesome and fascinating in its detail, but it had to be a lot.
Yeah. My sort of dumbest comment about writing this book is I was totally unprepared for the emotional toll of writing a book about 9/11. And it is, I was in college. It was in Boston. I have a pretty boring 9/11 story myself. I was at breakfast in the dining hall when when a friend came in to tell me about the two crashes at that point. And as boring and removed as my story is, I can remember every detail of that morning. I haven't been in that dining hall in 20 years, and I could walk right back into it and tell you the table that I was sitting at. I could tell you the chair I was sitting in. I could tell you, the way that my friend rested her hand on the table as she said that. She told us about the crashes. And I live in Vermont now, which is where I grew up. And, I looked up at the sky this morning, and, it is that same September severe, clear blue today that it was all up and down the East Coast on September 11th back in 2001. And that blue sky, I think, for so many of us who lived it on the East Coast, will be, probably the most haunting and enduring memory of that day.
Mm-hmm. So Bonnie wants to know, it is curious about kind of the observer's memory. Bonnie says, is there an optimum length of time that should pass before an observer's oral history is heard? How do recollections of important events change over time? Are oral histories ever repeated over time for this very reason?
Yeah, it's a great question. And this is the, nuts and bolts of oral history and why it matters and how it matters and how you use it, which is, memory is inherently fallible, and traumatic memory especially so. And the quality of oral history certainly degrades over time. And in part because what you see is, even people who are telling you the truth as they understand it and remember it begin to conflate moments, condense timelines. And for this project, I think I waded through about 2,000 oral histories. A lot of it guided through my research with a woman that I hired from the 9/11 Memorial and Museum in New York, who had been an oral historian, helping to gather some of these stories. But we went through probably about 2,000 of them. And, again, this between 2016 and 2019. And those had been gathered, as early as September and October 2001. The Pentagon, the military historians were right there doing oral history, and documenting the events at the Pentagon, within days and weeks of the attack, up through interviews that I was conducting even in 2019. Probably the bulk of them came sort of 2007-ish to 2010, 2011-ish, which were when the big oral history projects were being done at places like the 9/11 Museum, the 9/11 Tribute Center, the National Park Service, and things like that I was relying on for archives. You do have to spend some real time and effort in doing oral history with disentangling people's stories and figuring out the timelines and cross-checking them. But again, part of this is, to me, the work that I was trying to do was not to create the world's perfect, most accurate narrative of 9/11. If you want the precise tick-tock of 9/11, the 9/11 Commission Report is this incredible historical volume, that had been done by a large staff and took millions of dollars to execute, and that tells the precise details of 9/11 and how it happened, and what transpired and how and where and when. My goal was a little bit different, though, because with an oral history, as I said, what I was trying to do was tell how 9/11 was experienced and how it was lived. And so, to me, in some ways, the timelines mattered a little bit less. The precision matters a little bit less, in the memories, for an oral history than it does if you are trying to write a narrative history. I experienced this also, of course, in the book that I did this year, that was in some ways sort of a follow-up volume to the 9/11 history, which is an oral history of D-Day. Book came out in June for the 80th anniversary of D-Day. And the book is called When the Sea Came Alive, an oral history of D-Day, and pulls together about 700 voices from all sides of the D-Day conflict. Many of which were actually recorded decades after the events of World War II. Part of the challenge of doing a project like that is a lot of the veterans who came back from World War II didn't want to sit down immediately and start talking about their experiences in World War II. And so you really only around the 30th anniversary begin to see large-scale efforts to capture the veterans' stories and memories. And by that point, you do see real factual problems with some of the tales. Again, not intentional by any means, but people who might conflate a battle that happened on the second or third or fourth day ashore with something that happened on D-Day itself, or sort of people who misremember the geography of where they were when in those first hours ashore in Normandy in June of 1944. And so for me, working with material like that, you do have to spend a lot more time trying to trace back the actual unit histories to understand where people actually were and try to disentangle the parts of their story as they remember it from what was actually taking place on the ground.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned that When the Sea Comes Alive was kind of a follow-up to The Only Plane in the Sky. In the Only Plane in the Sky, there's this heartbreaking connection between the two. After having read both of them, and then going back and kind of looking at where I'd earmarked things, there's this man from Brooklyn in The Only Plane in the Sky who describes ashes raining down on him after the collapse of the South Tower. And then he relates back a memory and tells us that he's a Holocaust survivor and was in Auschwitz, and that when he was there, he knew that the ashes were human remains. Comes back to the present and says he knows that he's once again standing in ashes that are human remains.
Yeah.
It was very powerful, and it got me thinking about the juxtaposition of the two oral histories and how they do connect in some ways. When collecting the histories, did you see other moments like that?
Yeah, part of what attracted me to D-Day is, as I talked about, that the 9/11 oral history coming out at the 18th anniversary as 9/11 begins to slip from memory into history. The 80th anniversary, which we lived this year, in some ways marks the other end of that arc, where, I think the reason that anniversary felt so poignant to us this year, you saw President Biden and so many world leaders gather on the cliffs of Normandy to remember that invasion. is this moment, this 80th anniversary, is when we really see the passing of the final members of that greatest generation from World War II. D-Day had more than 1 million Allied personnel in motion across England and the English Channel that day. And that number today is reduced to just a few hundred remaining. Britain estimates that there are just 6 living D-Day survivors left. And one British D-Day survivor actually just passed away this week. So maybe it's actually only 5 now. We have now effectively every first-person memory we will ever have of D-Day. And so my goal with When the Sea Came Alive was to capture that other end of the arc, which is to go back and tell the story of D-Day in the voices of those who experienced it and lived it and fought it at a time when D-Day is fully slipping from memory into history, and to tell that story anew for now a world and a generation that will never know first-person memories of D-Day and the Normandy invasion.
Mm-hmm. Edgar is curious about the most surprising things that you learned from your research in both books.
Yeah. I think the thing that I don't know whether it's surprising but haunting in both books, but very much so, particularly in the 9/11 story, is the way that random luck, the way that fate played such an important role in that day. You know, the 1,000 little decisions that we make every single day, often, you know, without consciousness. You know, when to make a telephone call, when to stand up from our desk, when to have a cigarette, when to, you know, go have a snack, that, you know, which train you get on, which bus you get on, that day made the difference between life and death. You know, there's a story in the book of Michael Lamonaco, who was the chef at Windows on the World, the restaurant atop one of the towers. And on that morning of all mornings, he decided he was actually running a few minutes early and stopped to get new glasses at LensCrafters in the basement of the World Trade Center in the shopping concourse, rather than going straight up to his office. And you know, on any other day, he would have been up in his office at the restaurant in the kitchen by 8:46 in the morning. And that morning of all mornings, he made this, you know, one random errand, the type of thing, again, we do every single day without thinking about it. And he ended up surviving, and everyone at the restaurant who was there at 8:46 that morning died. You know, the number of people who lived or died because they had changed their flights at the last minute, you know, that they had been able to get on a plane that they thought that they weren't going to be able to get on. The creator of Family Guy, actually, that morning, was supposed to have been on one of the hijacked flights out of Boston. And his travel agent, this was, you know, an era before smartphone boarding passes, and his travel agent had just mistyped the departure time for his American Airlines flight to Los Angeles that morning by 10 minutes.
Wow.
And that meant that he showed up too late to get on board the plane. And, you know, he went to the lounge and, you know, fell off in a nap and woke up and discovered the, you know, the crash and the hijacking. I heard from one reader after the fact, after the book came out, who told me that he worked in the World Trade Center, and that morning he had stopped to get a blueberry muffin, and that but for stopping to get that blueberry muffin that morning, he would have been at his desk in the impact zone of the plane, and almost certainly been killed. And so he and his wife mark 9/11 every day or every year by his wife getting him a blueberry muffin. And that, so much of that day is about, these little decisions. There's a conference room at the Pentagon after it's been hit, where everyone who turned left when they left the Pentagon conference room died, and everyone who turned right as they came out of the conference room lived. And just these incredibly small decisions that day make the difference between life and death.
Mm-hmm. I know there's been over the years some controversy about different conspiracy theories, and we've received a few questions about that. Linda and Eileen and Teresa, among others, have said, how would you address conspiracy theorists regarding 9/11? And they say, I'm not one of them, but I'm aware of their arguments.
Yeah. I mean, it's unfortunate. This book came out 5 or 6 years ago now, and there's not a single 9/11 talk that I give that basically doesn't have a 9/11 conspiracy question related to it. At a very basic level, I've spent 20 years covering national security and government and politics. I've written books on the presidency and the Cold War and the FBI and all manner of sort of secret and intelligence operations and magazine articles, and at the most basic level, the reason that I think that the conspiracy theories are absurd is because they presuppose a level of competence, foresight, and planning and strategy that is not on display in the rest of the work that the government does. I mean, that's my sort of pejorative answer, but it's also the truth, which is, you look at these conspiracies, and just imagine what it would have taken to actually pull them off, and look at all of the other things that the government is unable to do that would be far simpler than that. At a more sort of philosophical level, though, to me, the 9/11 conspiracies are among the most vile parts of our public and civic life. That the suggestion that our government would be responsible for the deaths of not just a few, but thousands of our fellow citizens, and that members of our government and the intelligence services, and the law enforcement and military communities would be complicit in that, and help cover it up and not stand against that, is both vile and disgusting, and it betrays the real patriotism and mission and service and purpose that the people who go into our government to protect our country actually try to live in their lives and their careers. There's sort of a much longer arc to this that I've traced in other books. I wrote a book about Watergate that's begins to sort of trace the collapse of Americans' faith in government institutions. I wrote a book actually about the U.S. government and UFOs, which is all appearances to the contrary, not a conspiracist book. It's the story instead of sort of how UFO conspiracies took root in America. And I think that there is a fascinating arc across these books from Watergate to UFOs to 9/11 and on through more modern conspiracies like Sandy Hook or even January 6th that I think are all related and part and parcel of the same story in a strange and weird way.
So Carl is asking, how hard do you find it conveying what we felt to those that weren't born in 9/11? But I also want to kind of pair that with Julie from Martin County saying, I really loved this book. I listened to it on audiobook, and the way that it was structured brought back very emotional feelings from that day. And I really have to like echo that sentiment as well. So the way that you told the story in such a conversational tone and piecing it together, I feel like it imparts that emotion and that experience that everyone was going through. So I guess to add the question in there, how hard did you find it in conveying that? And to add Dan's question, did you craft your oral history with the audience in mind?
Yeah, I mean, to me, that's the real working on oral history is. I sometimes describe it as sort of the world's most interesting puzzle piece, where you have these. I start generally with thousands and thousands of snippets, and then try to sort of piece it together in a way like you saw in the chapter that I read aloud, where you can sort of hand off from one person to the next without having to use a lot of your own voice. That there's not a lot of introduction and sort of throat clearing by the author to set up anything more than the most basic facts and sometimes establish who a character is. But to me, that's really the fun part of crafting an oral history, is the way that you sort of get to tell these stories in the first person. And the way that you do that, the way that it sort of works and it comes together, I always describe as sort of looking both for the ordinary and the extraordinary. That when you're going through oral histories, when you're interviewing people or reading through archival materials, what you're really looking for are trying to figure out what are the most ordinary and typical experiences. If you were a office worker in the South Tower on 9/11, what was sort of the ordinary experience of the thousands of people who lived that? If you were an ordinary, regular firefighter showing up to the Twin Towers, or you were an air passenger somewhere across the United States on 9/11, what was that experience like, where you could be sort of representative of thousands or tens of thousands or even millions of people who had that same typical experience. And then you're really looking for the extraordinary, which are the most atypical experiences, the particularly strange, the particularly heroic, the particularly extreme versions of the human experience that day. And one of the things I always find interesting is that you don't always, that people who lived those experiences don't always recognize it in the moment. That there's one, the Only Plane in the Sky, there are not that many people that you sort of follow through the whole day. A lot of people sort of come and go in single chapters or a couple of chapters as they're sort of part of 9/11 comes and goes. One of the few people that you follow through the whole day is this survivor, Richard Eichen, who is one of the few survivors from above the 90th floor of the North Tower. And he evacuates all the, he's part of the crash, part of the sort of fiery impact, evacuates all the way down out of the tower, escapes just before the tower collapses, is caught in the collapse, then, gets himself to a hospital, is worried about follow-on attacks, and so leaves the hospital and hikes across the Brooklyn Bridge with just a Snapple, which we know because there's a photo of him in a hospital gown carrying the Snapple across the Brooklyn Bridge about midday on 9/11, and then hitchhikes his way home to Brooklyn. And I met him at the 9/11 Museum after the book came out, and he said to me, I can't believe you included my story. And I said, Richard, with all due respect, like, I read 2,000 of these stories, and yours is one of, the 4 or 6 most extraordinary stories that any human has on 9/11. Mm. And he had just never thought about his story in comparative terms. To him, it was just his story. And I went through sort of some of that same process with the D-Day book, where you go through, these thousands. That was actually even a larger set of research. That was about 5,000 oral histories that I started with. What was so striking there was how ordinary the extraordinary actually was on D-Day, where you had so many people who had their story of combat and survival happened on any day other than D-Day. It would be one of the sort of great annals of combat of World War II. The types of stories that we remember, decades later with medals of honor and distinguished service crosses. And yet on D-Day, might not even be the most extraordinary story in the 100-yard stretch of sand at their particular beach. Might not even be the most extraordinary story of their unit fighting, their paratroop unit fighting in the hedgerows, on the night of June 5th into the morning of June 6th, and that you saw so many people that day, pushed to the absolute limits of human survival and experience, amid this massive undertaking, probably the most audacious event in human history. And their story is just this tiny, tiny little sliver of that giant day.
Yeah. So you've mentioned the 9/11 Museum and reading through all of these oral histories. Kyle says, someone in the comments asked, what are some of the archives that house the 9/11 oral histories? Was it the museum eventually, Library of Congress, New York Public Library, etc.? And I also imagine for D-Day, you use the World War II Museum a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. So for the 9/11 book, for Only Plane in the Sky, the main archives, but by no means exclusive archives, that were the Pentagon's own historian's office, the 9/11 Memorial and Museum in New York, the 9/11 Tribute Center, the National Park Service, which did a tremendous oral history around Flight 93 and Shanksville, Pennsylvania, and the way that crash affected that community. And then, a whole host of other archives, including things like actually, since we're here with the libraries consortium across the country, the Arlington County Public Library in Arlington, Virginia, actually put out this incredible just locally produced oral history that I was able to mine. And then for the D-Day book, a large part of the repository for that work actually grew out of the archives at, as you said, the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, which started as a museum dedicated to D-Day. And they inherited, as part of their archives, archives created for what was originally called the Eisenhower Center, led by Stephen Ambrose, historian, noted historian, and probably the foremost expert at the time of D-Day, who in the 80s and 90s went out and solicited oral histories from veterans ahead of the 50th anniversary for 1994. That is really sort of just the treasure trove of documents and stories today. And then on the other side of the Atlantic, the Imperial War Museum in London has just these tremendous archives of the British experience.
Mm-hmm. So as we're winding down, we only have about 4 minutes left. I want to ask Janie's question. Janie says, as a true fan of Mr. Graff's work, I'd love to hear about his current and future projects.
Sure. So I'm writing one more oral history. I'm sort of knee deep, and you can't quite see it around.
One more, no more after that?
I'm running out of big events. I will say that, where I've got sort of the piles of papers and books all around me here in my office in Vermont that will come out next August. That's called Destroyer of Worlds, and it's an oral history of the Manhattan Project and the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Another sort of event that I think, again, next year will be the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II. Again, another moment that we're sort of seeing slip entirely from living memory into history. Mm-hmm. And so at this moment, when we have effectively all of the memories that we will ever have of the only time that the world has ever used an atomic bomb in wartime, I wanted to try to capture and tell that story. Again, unfortunately, at a moment where sort of nuclear weapons and nuclear tension feels sort of more present and challenging in our time today than it has, perhaps at any other time in my lifetime since the end of the Cold War.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what was the longest book to research and write?
So I spent about 2 to 3 years on an average book, with sort of that first year mostly being research and then a year of writing and editing. The book that I actually spent the longest on was a book that I did that came out in 2017 that was called Raven Rock. That is a story of the Cold War and the U.S. government's doomsday plans, and sort of all of the strange stuff that would have happened during and after a nuclear attack during the Cold War. And that book, that was about 5 or 6 years start to finish, in part just because of the vast amount of declassified documents I needed to go out and gather, and sort of the amount of different archives and presidential libraries I needed to make it out to around the country.
Yeah, I imagine. Okay, so Garrett, the last question that we like to close with is, what are you reading right now that you recommend everyone run out to their library and check out immediately?
So I read it a little bit earlier this summer, but I would recommend to everyone Adam Higginbotham's new book, Challenger, which is a narrative history of the space shuttle disaster. Adam is just one of my absolute favorite writers working now. His book, Midnight in Chernobyl, his last book, Midnight in Chernobyl, I think is one of the best narrative nonfiction books I've ever read in my entire life. And I was thrilled that he was tackling Challenger. And the book is sort of every bit as dramatic and fascinating as you would imagine an event like that would be.
Mm-hmm. Great recommendation. Thank you so much for joining us today. It truly has been a pleasure talking to you for the last hour, and thank you for all of your contribution to our history. I also want to extend a huge thank you to our viewers for tuning in to the Author Talk today. Without your support, none of this would be possible. So we thank you for choosing to spend your time with us. As a reminder, if you scroll below the live stream video, you can see the resources area, which contains a link to Garrett's books. We look forward to seeing you all again next week when we chat with New York Times bestselling authors Nate Klemp, followed by Leanne Moriarty later in the week. I am Brandon Adler, and thank you for joining us.